Steve Eisman from The Big Short is back in the news. He has fully disclosed the banks that he's shorting and explains exactly why he did so. In his view, he believes that overextended banks suffering is an absolute no-brainer, even without any particular 2008 financial crisis event happening. It's simply inevitable. You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we're going to look into Steve Eisman and what he had to say. There's an interview here that he did. I think it's really important to address some of the issues that he speaks on. Now, do I necessarily consider everything that he says to be true just because of the events during the financial crisis? No, absolutely not. But what he points out here are definitely factual. They really go in line with what we have talked about on this channel before. So what I did was I took the transcript of this and I read through it, and then from there I made a presentation I want to bring you through today. I want to go into exactly what he has shorted. I'll tell you that first. Then we're going to look at the deeper underlying issues. So let's begin by looking at the banks that he mentioned that he is shorting specifically. So let's begin with this. Number one, RBC. This bank here, number one. Number two, CIBC. And number three, Laurentian Bank. These three Canadian banks are being shorted right now by Steve Eisman. And why? Well, let's get into that in just a second. So we'll go through this presentation as quick as I possibly can. He talks about this normal credit cycle. Canada has not had a credit cycle in a few decades. I don't think that there's a Canadian bank CEO that knows what a credit cycle really looks like, and so I just think psychologically they're extremely ill prepared, and given how low the risk weights on their balance sheets are, I think they're unprepared for how much their capital ratios could go down if there's, again, I can't emphasize this enough, just a simple normalization of credit, not a calamity. So throughout this interview, he mentioned this multiple times. He's talking about a normal credit cycle, and this is what I talk about. There are cycles that happen. You can't avoid them. No, it doesn't have to be 2008. It doesn't have to be a financial crisis. It doesn't have to be 1929 type event. We could have major impact on particular companies, on particular sectors, or even the economy as a whole. It doesn't have to be some sort of massive event. That's what we need to understand. They do occur frequently throughout time, but the average person, as he mentions here, think about it. If you're in the real estate industry in Canada right now, or maybe in Australia, up until just recently, you have seen it only improve every single year. You've been there for 2 decades. You didn't even know that real estate could go down. You didn't know that interest rates could actually rise. Think about what that does to you psychologically if you're in that industry and you literally have never seen it. Obviously, you're not going to believe it if for 20 years there has been no other condition other than upward and onward. Let's look further into this. Bank reserves. By the way, these are quotes. I'm simply calling for is a normalization of credit losses, which Canada hasn't seen in over 20 years, and I think the banks, in terms of their reserves and their balance sheets, are woefully unprepared for that. Canadian banks divide their loan books into 3 buckets. They call them stage 1, 2, and 3. By the way, I tried to simplify this as much as possible using only the quotes that are necessary, but just stick with me for a moment. Stage 1 is the bulk of the loan book, and that's the loan book that is current. Stage 2 is early stage delinquencies. Stage 3 is late stage delinquencies. Okay, so most of the loans are in this stage 1. That is people who are paying up. However, stage 2 and stage 3, those are where you got those delinquencies, early and late. Essentially, this is part of his thesis. They had negative loan loss provisions for stage 1, and so if you added it all up in 2018 for all of the Canadian banks, the loan loss provisions in 2018 were almost all universally lower than in 2017, and that lower loan loss provision represents 90% of the earnings growth for Canadian banks. I don't get technical here, but just go with me for a minute. So my view is that at some point this nonsense of negative reserving on stage one is going to end, and the loan loss provisions for all of the Canadian banks are going to go up considerably. That's my thesis. So basically what he's saying is these banks have overextended themselves. They haven't really been preparing in order to suffer some losses. And as he says multiple times in this interview, he's not talking about anything catastrophic. He's simply referring to what will happen at some point because of these different events that occur. And we're just looking at something, let's say, normal. It is a normal process. That's what occurs, ups and downs. These banks here have been dealing with this fantasy land that everything is always going up and up and up. And how do you increase your profits? Well, you have to do the fudging of your accounting. He talks about that in this interview. I didn't want to really bring it all up in here, but basically they are using these nonsense way to calculate, and of course it looks fine, and as long as everybody's paying up, it's totally good. However, if we start to have some problems with the oil industry, that could have an impact. If we start having stuff with the retail locations, that could be a problem as well, okay, in the commercial loan space. What about what's going on with the real estate? It has been stagnating. Prices have fallen as well. We're always looking at these things. When people don't pay back, then we have a big issue, okay? So this is one part of it. Let's look further. Hard or soft landing? This is what he said. I just went to a lunch about Canada where all of the economists were all arguing whether or not Canada is going to have a soft landing or a hard landing, but it's going to be a landing of some kind or another. But if you talk to people in the real estate industry, you talk to people in the financial world in Canada right now, is it even possible for Canada to have some sort of recession? The answer is no. It's not possible. Never going to happen ever again. Unless it's some sort of catastrophic event that occurs. Look, everything is just fine. If you ask the average person, can real estate ever fall? The answer is no, it cannot. This is what they tell you because they're living in a fantasy land. They read their stories once upon a time and it ends with the end. I mean, that's how people's mentality is. Canadian banks should not be negative provisioning on stage one. They should be positive provisioning on stage one, and that's going to cause a very negative delta in terms of the earnings growth. Basically, he's saying that they are going to see a drop as a result. And then the interviewer tried to pull out of him, percentage-wise, what do you think? And it seemed like he wanted to go above 20%, but he wasn't very clear on that. He didn't really want to say in terms of percentages, and nobody does when they're being interviewed because it never works out the way you think it will. But essentially, he was going with 20+%, and that really is nothing when you think about it. 20%, I mean, just look what happened from October to December. You had a lot of these markets that were down entirely 20%. Some of the stocks like Goldman Sachs, I think, was down approximately 40% from its peak down to the lowest point. So that's not really something that you shouldn't think about in a way where 20%, it's not significant, but we'll see what happens. So that's all I wanted to get to in this episode here. I'm just showing you what he said and why, because it's important to focus on the reasons why an individual like this would be shorting Canadian banks. You don't just want to know that it's a good idea. They give you one sentence and you go with it. That's not a good reason. You need to understand what's happening in the financial industry. You need to know about this if you wanted to go into it yourself, or you want to understand the ripple effect, because think about the impact that this has. If we start seeing something in the real estate industry, maybe it's then going to affect the banks. If it affects the banks, maybe they're going to have some problems further down the road in other ways too. Maybe individuals will start getting laid off because so many people work for one of these financial establishments. In Canada, they are all of the tallest towers in most major cities anyway. This could happen. It could have an effect on so many people, but they don't realize it. They think that this is a game. They don't ever look into into the cause and effect. They're not looking about how things balance out there, and unfortunately they get burned over and over again. So you always have to do your own due diligence. I try to do as much as I possibly can, even providing 2 videos a day. It's really not enough. You got to be studying all the time, and you have to do what you can with your own money, with your own books, to make sure they are all in order. You can't look like the Canadian banks. If you look like the Canadian banks, then you're going to be in trouble, that's for sure. So get your stuff in order, and you can do so by working hard every day to learn, to get your stuff, whatever you feel that is important, to make sure that that's a priority for you, okay? It's not some sort of New Year's resolution and you give up right after that. No, you have to get on this, whether that's getting out of debt, whether that's earning more income, whether that's saving some money, whether that's, investing options. There's a lot here, but I just want you to know that all of this right now, that what we're seeing is very important and it should never be taken lightly. That's all for this video. If you found it informative, please give me a thumbs up. When you give me a like on the video, you are supporting me, you're supporting this channel, so I do appreciate that very much. If you want the financial education that wasn't taught to you in school, well then, these 2 books have everything you need, from the foundation, the history, the asset classes, how to make money. Everything is in the link in the description. If you want the audiobook, that's available at themoneygps.com. Over 6,000 stores in the United States are scheduled to close down in 2019. There are potentially, according to UBS, 75,000 more that will be coming in the next few years. If you haven't watched the video already, click on it and I will see you there.